Hello students! Today's video lecture is on the basic structure and function of the eye. One of the first things I want to talk to you about is the external surface and some basic anatomy about the external area. So we have this picture of the eye here. This is a right eye, and so the nose would be over here on this side. So you'll notice in the list of words we have something called a canthus, something called a palpebra, and then something called a caruncle. So the canthus is a corner of the eyelid where the upper lid and the lower lid meet. And so we have a medial canthus and a lateral canthus. And so the definition for both of those will be the medial corner of the eyelids and the lateral canthus will be the lateral corner. So let's go ahead and label that on our diagram, knowing that the nose will be in this position here. So this corner of the eyelids closest to the nose will be the medial canthus, and the corner of the eyelids further from the nose will be the lateral canthus. Next on the list, we have a superior palpebra and an inferior palpebra. Palpebra is a word that means eyelid. So we have superior or upper eyelid and inferior or lower eyelid. And let's go ahead and label our superior palpebra as the upper eyelid and inferior palpebra as the lower eyelid. Okay, the last external feature that you will have noticed as you look at your eyes that there's a fleshy mass right next to the medial canthus. That's called the lacrimal caruncle. And lacrimal caruncle does not have a distinct function. It does contain some sebaceous or oil glands, but it seems to be a redundant feature, meaning we already have oil glands in other places around the eye, so we're not really sure what the lacrimal caruncle's purpose is, other than it does contain some oil glands. So I'm going to describe it as being the fleshy mass near the medial canthus. Okay, before we leave this external features area, I wanted to talk to you about the other oil glands besides what we have found in the lacrimal caruncle. And I have an image I wanted to show you. So this is a close-up of the upper eyelid. And you can see here there's these little white dots. There are oil glands along the very edge, here's eyelashes, of your eyelid. And so I put in the notes, both upper and lower eyelids contain small oil glands called meibomian glands. These glands produce an oily secretion that prevents your eyelids from sticking together. Ugh. So it keeps them lubricated so they don't get dry and stick together. The oils will mix with your tears and make the surface of the eye perfectly smooth so we don't get any weird bending of light as it tries to enter the eye. And if you ever get one of these glands clogged, it's actually called a chalazion. A lot of people will call it a sty. It's almost like a pimple, but on your eyelid. I wouldn't recommend trying to pop it because it will hurt like crazy. And if you get a sty, you can put a warm washcloth, put some water on the washcloth, warm it up, and put it over your eye until that opens up and the secretions come out. Or better yet, if it's this bad, please go see the doctor. So anyway, those are called meibomian glands. The next topic is accessory structures surrounding the eye, and this is going to be called the lacrimal apparatus. All these parts are called the lacrimal apparatus, and lacrimal is a Latin word that means tears. So this has to do with tear production and drainage. So we can see all these parts that are surrounding the eye. Let's start with tear production, which is happening in this gland that is underneath the lateral portion of your upper eyelid. So it's not right here on the surface, obviously, it's in this position, and that is called the lacrimal gland, and that is the gland that produces tears. So the tears are produced in the gland, and then they will exit the gland and be able to wash over the surface of the eye through these tiny little tubes called excretory ducts. Letter B are representing the excretory ducts, and that's how the tears get out of the gland and onto the surface of the eye. Notice the tears will flow from the lateral corner, lateral canthus, towards the medial canthus where they will drain. And part C represents the first part of the drainage. Those are called the lacrimal canaliculi. And essentially the word canaliculi is a word that means very, very tiny canal. So we have a superior lacrimal canaliculus and an inferior lacrimal canaliculus. And there's a tiny, tiny opening, which perhaps you've seen on the lower lid. It looks like a little speck of dirt almost. That's an opening, and your tears will drain into those openings into these little tubes called the lacrimal canaliculi. From there, they'll collect at letter D, the lacrimal sac. And if you're careful and you kind of press between the medial corner of your eye and your nose, there's a little bump that you'll feel underneath the skin, and that's the lacrimal sac. They will drain down, and notice they're going to dump out of your nose. And this duct that leads into the nose from the rest of the lacrimal apparatus is called the nasolacrimal duct. Remember, nasal means nose and lacrimal means tears. So it says tears drain down this tube and empty into the nasal cavity. So the tears help to clean the eye. They also help to moisten part of the nasal cavity. And if you have an excess production of tears, like when you're crying, that's why your nose runs. Lastly, there's actually an enzyme in the tears that helps to kill bacteria. So not only do the tears moisten the eye, they help keep the nasal cavity moist, but they have an enzyme called lysozyme that kills bacteria. So that's pretty helpful, keeping our eye healthy. All right, our next topic, before we get to the actual eyeball itself, we're going to talk about the extrinsic eye muscles, and that means the muscles that are outside of the eye. All right, so there's basically two types of muscles around the outside of the eye that will move the eyeball itself. There's the ones A, B, C, and D that go straight back from the front of the eye, straight backwards. And you'll notice those are called the rectus muscles. So rectus means straight. Then we have two types of muscles that come off at a very strange angle. That's letters E and F. And oblique means at an angle. This is actually very similar to the abdominal muscles, where the rectus abdominis was straight up and down on the body, and the oblique muscles were at an angle. So those same words are applied in this section as well. And for the first four, it basically says the eye will move in this direction. So superior rectus is letter A, and when this muscle contracts, it will pull the eye upwards. So you will look upwards when superior rectus contracts. So you can see as I'm coloring the superior rectus that it does stretch straight backwards from the eye. And actually all these muscles are going to surround the optic nerve, which is right here in the center area. So superior rectus pulls the eye up, and it's letter A. The inferior rectus, you may be able to guess, pulls the eye down. And for us, we don't get to see too much of it, but it is letter B in the diagram. So I'll go ahead and color that as well. So it starts here at the front of the eye, beyond the eyelid, so we're not going to be able to see these muscles. Stretching underneath the eye, and we can catch a little bit of it back here as well. So that's just the opposite of superior rectus. And I'll go ahead and show you on the app that I have. Here is the eyeball. This is a left eye, and medial is over here because we see the lacrimal sac and the nasolacrimal duct. This is the nose side. So if I tip to the top, the superior rectus is here, and you can see how it goes straight back towards the optic nerve. And the inferior rectus is underneath and also goes straight back towards the optic nerve. Okay, so we have superior rectus and inferior rectus. You may be able to guess that we also have a medial rectus on the nose side that will cause the eye to look medially, and a lateral rectus on the outside of the eye towards the ear side that will cause the eye to look away from the nose. So I've mentioned both of the directions. I'm going to go ahead and add color to both of those as well. The other two muscles are both obliques. Remember, that's going to tell us that they're the ones that are coming off the eye at sort of a strange direction. So we're looking at letters E and F. And E is extremely strange. It actually hooks into this little pulley on the medial aspect. So again, the nose would be on this side here. So this is going to pull in a strange direction. Okay, so whenever you see the oblique word in the name, the first thing you think is that it's going to pull the eye laterally. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and rate that for both of them. This is like pulling the eye in two directions. So I'm going to go back and add to this, but I'm going to put that twice. Pulls eye laterally. Now, the second part, because these both pull the eye in a sort of diagonal direction, so it's laterally and then you're going to think about the opposite of this. So even though it's located on the top of the eye, it's the superior oblique. When it pulls, because of this pulley action, it's going to make the eye look laterally and down. So down being the opposite of superior, because superior means up. Then the same is going to be true down here for the inferior oblique. It pulls the eye laterally, and the opposite of inferior is superior. So upwards. Very strange situation. So pulls the eye laterally and down, and letter F pulls the eye laterally and up. And I'm going to go ahead and color those so you can see their position. Okay, lastly, just in case you're wondering, this structure back here is labeled as the optic nerve. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So all of those muscles sort of collect around the optic nerve as they progress backwards away from the eye. And then this little piece right here is representing a muscle that attaches to the eyelid. So we're going to ignore that completely because it doesn't move the eye directly, instead moving the eyelid. Okay, we're going to move on to the layers of the eye. So moving on to the eye itself. And the eye is made of three main layers. I'm going to go ahead and show you in the anatomy app. I'm going to start with this view, and I'm going to delete this lacrimal sac, the nasolacrimal duct, and these lacrimal canaliculi so they're not in the way. I'm also going to go ahead and get rid of all the muscles and the gland. So I have deleted most of the unnecessary items at this point, but I'm going to start from this side because it has a superficial view. So the eye has three main layers. It's got this outer layer that's white. And if I turn completely to the side, that white layer continues to be a clear windshield at the front. So that's the outermost layer. Underneath that is this layer here, and you can see that the white has been cut away, so we have this layer here, which is really darkly pigmented. And as it gets closer to the front of the eye, it actually becomes a couple other structures. And then I've got this layer here at the very deepest layer of the eye. So three main layers there, and we'll go ahead back to the notes and fill in some information. All right, so I mentioned the outermost layer has the two parts. The white part of the eye, which is the larger of the two parts, is known as the sclera. Sclera, it is a very tough and fibrous layer. It helps maintain the shape of the eyeball as the eye muscles are pulling on it. And as that sclera here approaches the front of the eye, that we can see that there is a change and it becomes clear over this front. And you can only really visualize that clear aspect when I turn the eye completely to the side. So this windshield-like structure at the front of the eye that's clear is known as the cornea. And it's the same layer as the sclera, but it's changed its consistency and its structure, and it's now known as the cornea. Now, the cornea is very important because the cornea's job is to begin focusing the light rays. And it does quite a bit of that job. There's only one other structure in the eye that does the focusing. So it's the cornea, and the other structure is going to be called the lens. If someone has LASIK eye surgery to correct their vision, it's the thickness of the cornea that's modified. So depending on the shape of the cornea, sometimes determines whether people can see clearly or not, or need corrective lenses. So we've got sclera and cornea as our outermost layer. If I delete the sclera, you'll notice I still have my cornea here, but we have this very strange middle layer known as the choroid. The choroid. And you can see here it's kind of a brownish, but it has a tremendous amount of blood vessels, and it's also darkly pigmented. So I'm going to put here the middle layer is called the choroid layer. It has a lot of blood supply, which we saw, and is darkly pigmented. So if there are extra light rays entering the eye, this dark pigmentation will absorb those extra rays. If the rays are able to penetrate through this layer here, they'll be absorbed by this layer here, so they won't bounce around inside the eye. So that's the choroid layer. And then in the notes it says the choroid divides to become two different structures at the front of the eye. And I'm actually going to head down to the diagram to give you a visual on this. So here is the eye, and it is a view like this. The only difference is it's been cut completely in half. So that's one of the more difficult concepts regarding the eye, is that it's a round structure. It's got definitely 3 dimensions. And when we look at it on paper, it's a little bit hard to understand. So let's go ahead and label what we know so far. The outermost layer of the eye is called the sclera. And my arrow should be pointing to this thick white section here. And as we follow the sclera anteriorly towards the front of the eye, it becomes the cornea. So that is this label right here. And I would say the difference, if we were to, make a mark where the cornea and the sclera meet, that mark would be right about here. So from here to here, between my little dots is the cornea, and then everything else is the white part called the sclera. Okay. Then deep to that, we have the dark layer, which is this arrow right here called the choroid. And remember in our app, it was like a dark brown color. That's the choroid layer. So watch as this black approaches the front of the eye, and then we see a change happening right in here. Here's the choroid layer, and then as it approaches the front of the eye, it becomes 2 different things. One is here at this arrow, and the other is here. A lot of times you'll see it drawn a little differently, but both of these structures that the choroid turns into at the front of the eye are muscles. So let's head back to the notes and we'll fill in those structures. All right, so the choroid becomes 2 different structures at the front of the eye. The first one I think you've probably heard of is called the iris. And the iris is the colored part of the eye, and it's a muscle that controls how much light enters the eye. So let's go to our app and take a look. I'm going to delete my cornea. It's going to look really strange without it. And my drainage for eye fluid. And I'm going to zoom in so we can see the iris. And I've highlighted it. You can see it has sort of a disc shape with an opening in the middle. This opening is the pupil. This is the black opening at the center of the eye. It's a hole. Really, I shouldn't be able to click on it because it's an opening, but it says pupil and it's just an opening. So here's the iris, and we know that the iris changes size to allow the pupil to become bigger or smaller to allow more or less light in. So the iris is a muscle controlling the amount of light entering the eye. It has an opening in it called the pupil. When the iris is relaxed, the pupil is large, and that will let lots of light in. That happens at night when there's not much light, so we want to let in as much as possible. When the iris is contracted, the pupil is small, and think a smaller opening will let less light in. So this is what happens when it's very bright out. So the iris is the colored part of the eye, and I'm going to add that just as a little side note, just to make sure we can identify it later. It can be blue or brown or green or gray or hazel or whatever. And that has no bearing whatsoever on how it functions. The color is just a genetic expression. So that's part of that choroid layer, but it's at the front of the eye. Then the second part, we come down here and we see this is the iris here. Let's go ahead and label that. I'm going to get rid of my red, and I'm actually going to make that blue because that's an eye color. So this part here and here is the iris. Now here's what's tricky about that. That does not look like the iris, but it does in a cross-section like what we're looking at, a sagittal section. So imagine we were going to cut this straight down the middle. We'd have a piece up here, then a hole, and then a piece down here, which is exactly what we're seeing in the notes. So 2 labels we can add. One is the iris, and that is right here. And then this is actually the opening in the iris. We're not looking at this structure here, but the hole in the iris, and that's the pupil. So light will enter the eye. It passes through the cornea, through this space, and through the pupil. And then we'll discuss what happens after that. The other part of that choroid layer is still up here, and that's a muscle, but it's attached to this structure here in the middle. And that structure is called the lens. And as you may guess, the lens is the other part of the eye, besides the cornea, that helps to focus light rays. So this muscle here, the other part of the choroid layer, is the muscle that controls the shape of the lens and allows us to focus at different distances. So that muscle is known as the ciliary body. The ciliary body adjusts the shape of the lens by pulling on it. And it's actually attached with these really small ligaments to the lens, and those ligaments are called suspensory ligaments. So in our diagram, we can add a couple more labels. That muscle is the ciliary body. And I'm going to add some color just so you know what we're looking at here. Same down here. And then the suspensory ligaments are these tiny little strands here and here. And actually, they go all the way around the lens. I'll show you in the app. That attach the muscle to the lens so that when the muscle contracts, the lens is also changed. So those are the suspensory ligaments at both of those arrows. All right, let's take a minute and go back to our app so you can see this in a little bit more realistic view. Okay, so remember I've deleted my white part and my cornea, the white part called the sclera, and I'm looking at the choroid. And then at the beginning, at the front of the eye, the choroid turns into the iris that has the hole called the pupil. The ciliary muscle, the ciliary body is here. And if I zoom in from behind, you can see it actually has that full disc shape as well. And then this center part is the lens, and it's like a soft, flexible pea almost, but it's sort of flatter. And it changes it's able to focus the light rays onto the innermost layer of the eye. So here's the lens, and then these tiny, tiny little strands are the suspensory ligaments. So notice that they're all the way around the lens, hooking the lens to the muscle here. Okay, so here's the ciliary body. These are the suspensory ligaments, and they attach to the lens, which is right behind the pupil. And that takes care of that middle layer of the eye, the choroid, turning into the ciliary body and the iris. All right, lastly, the innermost layer is called the retina. And it says in the notes, if your eye is working properly, the images you see are focused directly onto the retina. If you're like me and your eye isn't working properly, you need corrective lenses to help you do that. Within the retina, that's the innermost layer of the eye, there are specialized neurons that are sensitive to light, and those specialized neurons are known collectively as photoreceptors. Representing the word light. So we've got light-sensitive cells in the retina. Where is the retina? It's this innermost layer here that has some lines in it. And I'm actually going to go ahead and color my retina kind of an orangish color, just so it's separated visually from the other two layers, but it is quite orange in its appearance inside the eye. And we'll see that in the app as well. Now, keep in mind, this lines the entire back of the eye, not just this little strip. And the app will give us a good visual of that. So this is the retina, and that's where the light-sensitive cells are. There's two types of photoreceptors found in the retina. There are cells called rods and cells called cones, and they're special neurons. So in your notes it says there's two types of photoreceptors. The first type that's sensitive to color are called cones. So cones are a type of special cell that is sensitive to the different colors, and I'm going to highlight that. Cones are for colors. The other type of cell is called a rod cell. So there's rods that are just sensitive to light, and we use those only in dim light to tell us whether there's light or not. Rods do not see any colors. They do not perceive colors. We use them in dim light. And in bright light, rods are totally non-functional, and we use our cones. So you can think of it like daytime and nighttime, but really it's color and or just the perception of light. So rods and cones are found in the retina. Now, what happens when light comes in the eye and hits the rods and cones? When the photoreceptors, rods and cones, are stimulated by light, they generate electrical impulses that travel to the optic nerve connected to the back of the eye. So I'm going to do something a little strange here. If you remember what a neuron looks like, we've got our cell body with our little dendrites. Of course, it's not a perfect replica of this. That would be all throughout the retina, would be all the cell bodies and their dendrites. Okay, I'm just going to do a couple. Then the axons will stretch to the back of the eye and collect to form the structure called the optic nerve. Okay, so we've got each neuron's axon is in the retina and it's stretching to the back. And then this one. Okay, and it's the axons of all those rods and cones that are bundled into the optic nerve. That does leave us with a dilemma when we get to this spot right here. It's so busy with all of the axons from the rods and cones coming together that it's actually a blind spot within the eye. Okay, because there's no cell bodies or dendrites there. It's all the axons. So it's sort of like where the eye, if you think of it in terms of electrical line, that's where the eye is plugged in at the back. So there's no sensitivity there, but we can compensate for that in our brain. All right, so the photoreceptors are stimulated by light. They make electrical impulses that travel out the optic nerve to the occipital lobe of the brain for processing. All right, so if we look at our app, here's the iris, and right behind that, the ciliary body, and then our innermost layer is the retina. And you can see, even though it's cut open, it does take up the entire inside of the eye. And then notice where the optic nerve connects to the back of the eye is a special spot. That's the blind spot. It's also known as the optic disc. And that's actually a blind spot within the eye. This second spot is something that we'll talk about at another time. Quick review, we've got the sclera is the white part at the outside, and that becomes the cornea at the front of the eye, and that's clear. That helps to begin focusing light rays. Underneath the sclera is the choroid layer, middle layer, that becomes the iris, determining the size of the pupil, and the ciliary body, which is connected to the lens by the suspensory ligaments. Okay, and the lens finishes the focusing, and these suspensory ligaments attach the lens to the muscle so that it can change the shape of the lens. And then the innermost layer is the retina, comprised of photoreceptors called rods and cones that are sensitive to rods, light, and cones, colors. Those are all axons that are bundled together at the back of the eye and exit the eye through the optic nerve.